Everything you think you know about Japan's first great unifier is wrong. You're about to learn how one of history's most misunderstood leaders changed Japan forever, and why his own general betrayed him in the most shocking way possible. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some people call him Japan's first modern leader, while others consider him history's most brilliant madman. In 1534, Japan was literally tearing itself apart. Hundreds of warlords fought endless battles for control, turning the country into a bloodbath that lasted over a century. This period, known as the Sengoku era or Age of Warring States, was so violent that even farmers carried weapons while working their fields. Villages would burn at night, and no one knew if they'd wake up under a new warlord's control. But one teenager was about to change everything. His name was Oda Nobunaga, and his family thought he was insane. When Nobunaga's father died, instead of crying at the funeral like everyone else, 16-year-old Nobunaga showed up in rags and started throwing incense at the altar while dancing and laughing. He threw the incense so hard it bounced off the ceiling. The priests were horrified, and his mother covered her face in shame. People called him the Fool of Owari, but they had no idea what was going on in his mind. You see, Nobunaga wasn't crazy. He played one of the most brilliant mind games in Japanese history. By acting like a complete lunatic, he made his enemies underestimate him. And that's exactly what he wanted. His brother Nobuyuki thought he could easily take control of the clan from this fool, but Nobunaga proved him wrong in the most dramatic way possible. When Nobuyuki tried to assassinate him, Nobunaga not only survived but turned the tables so completely that Nobuyuki ended up having to commit suicide. If you were a powerful warlord, would you waste resources attacking someone everyone thought was an idiot? Of course not. But while his enemies laughed at him, Nobunaga secretly built the most advanced army Japan had ever seen. He spent countless hours studying military tactics, even reading Chinese war manuals that most Japanese leaders ignored. He learned everything he could about new weapons and strategies while everyone else assumed he was wasting time. Here's where things get really interesting. In 1560, Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the strongest warlords in Japan, marched toward Nobunaga's territory with an army of 25,000 men. Nobunaga only had 2,500 soldiers. Everyone thought he was finished. His own advisors begged him to surrender or commit suicide to save face. But Nobunaga saw something nobody else did. It was pouring rain that day, and Imagawa's massive army had stopped to rest near a place called Okehazama. His soldiers took off their armor, drank sake, and celebrated their upcoming victory. They'd brought along their finest silk banners and most expensive equipment to make their triumph more impressive. They didn't know that Nobunaga had been studying the weather patterns in that valley for months. He knew that on summer afternoons, massive thunderstorms would roll in. While Imagawa's army was relaxing, Nobunaga led his small force through hidden mountain paths he'd discovered as a child. These weren't just any paths, they were so steep and dangerous that his men had to use ropes to climb some sections. Many of his soldiers thought this was suicide, but Nobunaga had practiced this route so many times he could practically do it blindfolded. When the thunder started booming, he made his move. Imagawa's soldiers thought the noise was just more thunder, but it wasn't. It was Nobunaga's cavalry charging down the hillside through the storm. The rain had soaked the silk banners and expensive armor, weighing down Imagawa's men. Their bowstrings were wet and useless. Their heavy equipment, meant to impress, slowed them down in the mud. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. In less than half an hour, Nobunaga had killed Imagawa and scattered his massive army. The fool had just pulled off one of Japanese history's most brilliant surprise attacks. This battle changed everything. Suddenly, the Fool of Owari wasn't so foolish anymore. Other warlords started looking at Nobunaga differently. Some wanted to join him. Others were terrified of him. But everyone knew this man was going to change Japan forever. And to change it, He did. Nobunaga was centuries ahead of his time. While other warlords stuck to tradition, he revolutionized warfare. He was the first Japanese leader to really understand the power of guns. When Portuguese traders brought muskets to Japan, most samurai rejected them as dishonorable. They called guns cowardly weapons that went against the samurai spirit. But Nobunaga didn't care about tradition. He cared about winning. He ordered thousands of muskets and created the world's first factory assembly line for gun production. His gunsmiths could produce more firearms in a month than European workshops could make in a year. He created the first organized military drilling system in Japanese history. His soldiers practiced firing in coordinated volleys, something that wouldn't become common in Europe for another 100 years. This might not sound like a big deal, but imagine being a traditional samurai warrior, charging forward with your sword, only to face hundreds of guns firing at you in perfect sequence. It was absolutely devastating. One Portuguese observer wrote that Nobunaga's gun squads were more disciplined and effective than any European army he'd ever seen. But Nobunaga wasn't just a military genius. He also transformed Japan's economy. He abolished toll roads that were choking trade. Before Nobunaga, merchants had to pay fees at hundreds of checkpoints to move goods across Japan. Some roads had tolls every few miles. Nobunaga smashed this system, making trade faster and cheaper than ever before. He eliminated monopolies that were making merchants rich while keeping everyone else poor. He even started a free market system where prices were set by supply and demand, not by powerful guilds or corrupt officials. His religious policies were just as revolutionary. He welcomed Christian missionaries because he saw how their knowledge of science and mathematics could help Japan advance. He was fascinated by European astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. While other Japanese leaders were suspicious of foreigners, Nobunaga gave them land to build churches and schools. He even wore European clothes sometimes, shocking traditional Japanese nobles. Some people say Nobunaga was cruel, and yes, he could be absolutely ruthless. When Buddhist monks opposed him, he burned their temples and killed thousands. The mighty temples of Mount Hiei had stood for 700 years before Nobunaga destroyed them. When cities resisted him, he made examples of them. But here's what most people don't understand. Japan was already suffering through endless civil wars. Nobunaga believed that he could only end the cycle of violence through complete unification. He wanted to build a new Japan, one based on merit instead of birth, on innovation instead of tradition. By 1582, he was incredibly close to achieving his dream. He controlled most of central Japan and was preparing to take the rest. His loyal general, Akechi Mitsuhide, was leading an army to help him. At least, that's what Nobunaga thought. He didn't know that his own success had planted the seeds of his destruction. On June 21st, Nobunaga was staying at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with just a small guard force. He had no reason to worry. Mitsuhide was supposed to march in the opposite direction. But Mitsuhide had secretly turned his army around. In the early morning hours, thousands of soldiers surrounded the temple. Nobunaga was literally sleeping while his destiny was being decided. Nobunaga woke up to flames and smoke. Mitsuhide had ordered the temple burned down. We'll never know exactly what happened in those final moments, but most historians believe Nobunaga committed seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than be captured. Some accounts say he had time to write a final poem before the end. The man who had come so close to unifying Japan died in flames, betrayed by someone he trusted. We still don't know exactly why Mitsuhide betrayed him. Some say Nobunaga had insulted him publicly. Others think he was secretly working with Nobunaga's enemies. There's even a theory that he was trying to protect the imperial court from Nobunaga's growing power. But the truth died with him just 13 days later, when Nobunaga's loyal general Toyotomi Hideyoshi hunted him down and killed him in the Battle of Yamazaki. Mitsuhide's betrayal earned him the nickname the 13-Day Shogun, the time between his betrayal and death. Nobunaga didn't live to see Japan unified, but without him, it would never have happened. His successors, Hideyoshi and later Tokugawa Ieyasu, finished what he started. They used his innovations, strategies, and vision to create today's Japan. The Japan that emerged was different from what Nobunaga had planned. It was more traditional, more closed to foreigners, but its strength and stability came directly from his reforms. So next time someone tells you Oda Nobunaga was just a cruel warlord, remember this: he was actually a revolutionary who dragged Japan into the modern age. Yes, his methods were brutal. Yes, he made enemies. But he also ended a century of chaos and laid the foundation for centuries of peace. He proved that sometimes the craziest seeming person in the room might actually be the smartest. The craziest part is that if his own general hadn't betrayed him, he might have achieved everything he dreamed of. Instead, he became one of history's greatest what-if stories, and proved that sometimes the line between genius and madness isn't as straightforward as we think. Subscribe to learn more about history's most fascinating events.